Now, the long-awaited and indeed partially leaked Scally report was finally released just about 15 minutes ago. And joining me now in studio to discuss this is Minister for Health, Simon Harris. Minister, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Ciara.
Firstly, I let's go to what has been leaked, and I might ask you about the leak in just a moment. But one of the main thrusts that was leaked was that there wasn't going to be, in Scally's view, an indication for a commission of investigation. Is there going to be an investigative inquiry going forward, or are you taking on board what Scally has said?
I think what I'm doing this afternoon is not making any knee-jerk decisions. To be very honest, when I've made mistakes in the past on this issue, being quite truthful, it's because I've made knee-jerk decisions. We asked an expert to come and do a huge body of work, and we'll get into that in a moment. He's read 12,800 documents. He or his team have visited all the labs. He's worked with 3 other doctors. He's interviewed all the key people involved, and he's come up with really robust recommendations. He has decided it's not a recommendation of his. He's actually just said in the foreword, it's my view, effectively, that there'd be a better mechanism or a better process than a commission of investigation. But let me be very clear. The factual position is the government and the opposition decided there should be a commission of investigation into Cervical Check. Because of the importance of the issue, particularly around women needing to know were the lab's safe, we decided it made sense to do some scoping first. We were then planning on moving into the commission. I suppose this unexpected development has happened where Dr. Scally has done a much more comprehensive piece of work than was perhaps originally envisaged. And he has said, he wasn't asked to say, but he has decided to say that the commission is not necessary. What I will be doing is suggesting that everybody, before they comment on the report, reads it. Let's Dr. Scally speak to it. Let's Dr. Scally answer questions. Here's crucially from those who've been impacted by the non-disclosure, people like Vicky Phelan and Stephen Teep and Lorraine Walsh. And I'll meet with them and I'll meet with the opposition in the next week or two, and we'll make a decision. If there's a need for a commission, let's do it. If there's a better way of doing it, let's do that too. So the commission is certainly not off the table. But I think it would be terrible if today became about the next process. Let's deal with this very comprehensive one first. All
right, so currently no decision taken on an investigation going forward. You mentioned Vicky Phelan there. Vicky Phelan, Stephen Teep, many of the families, first of all, were very upset and rightly so about the leak. And second of all, described what they had seen from that leak as a whitewash. Have you spoken with those families?
I was spoken with Vicky and Stephen, and indeed Lorraine was in the room on a call that I was on with the others. Look, Vicky Phelan is someone I actually view as a friend at this stage. I speak to her very regularly. She speaks to me very regularly, similarly with Stephen Teep. Their whole aim has been to build a better screening programme. And every step of the way before something got announced, whatever it was, I've always spoken to them. I mean, when I woke up yesterday morning to see that headline, I just felt like a right kick in the gut. I cannot imagine how they must have felt, how devastated they must have been. So whoever leaked it, I mean, why would they have leaked it? Certainly this idea that there was any political benefit in leaking is a bit stupid.
Micheál Martin said this morning on News Talk Breakfast that he believed the government had leaked it.
Well, look, I mean, I don't play petty politics with this. I'm not going there. I mean, if some politician can explain to me what benefit there would have been to setting myself against people that I value and regard as friends who've been hurt by this, I don't see it. I mean,
so you're denying the Department of Health had any role in that whatsoever?
The Department of Health had it, the Department of the Taoiseach had it, the Attorney General had it. I'm not accusing Dr. Scally, but obviously his team had it. Lots of people had this report. As you get closer to publication day, more and more
government bodies, Simon.
More and more people, not necessarily all government bodies. But the point is, whoever leaked it, was quite disgusting what they did. It caused huge upset. The only thing, and nothing good came of this, but I made the decision yesterday that Dr. Scally would actually go and travel to Limerick and meet Vicky, Stephen and Lorraine, and thank God they had a 5.5 hour meeting. And I think, without speaking for them, because they're well able to speak for themselves and it's important they do, but I think it's fair to say they found that meeting extremely useful in going through the report in great detail, and I'm glad that happened.
Okay, let's come back to what Scally has said. He's made 50 recommendations for screening in Ireland going forward. A lot of people have questions about this. Some people still slightly confused as to exactly what has happened in terms of cervical check. But let's talk about quality control issues to start off with. Can Irish women today, going to their doctor today for a smear test, trust the results of those smear tests, and can they have confidence in the labs specifically that we are currently using?
Yes, and the great thing for Irish women is it's not my word, it's an expert opinion from Dr. Scally, 3 other doctors, the senior counsel and the barrister at law that he worked with. They visited the labs. Now I need to talk about another lab issue in a moment, but the labs that are contracted today, being used by screening services today, Dr. Scally has found, and I'm going to quote it because it's such an important issue, he says, "I am satisfied with the quality management processes in the current laboratory sites." experts. He then lists them. He then also goes on to say later in the report, the continuation of cervical screening in the coming months is of crucial importance. My scoping inquiry team has found no reason why the existing contracts for laboratory services should not continue until the HPV regime is introduced. So Dr. Scally, we've had a lot of people comment on labs. An eminent international medical expert has said our labs are safe. So if I think the women of Ireland can hear that message and should hear that message very clearly. And it's important that we get that message from an expert like Dr. Scally.
A huge amount of the concern around cervical check, Simon, was to do with the labs. And I'm just going to stay on them for a moment. That people felt the labs we were using, this idea that outsourcing had somehow made our screening unsafe. Are these labs that we're currently using the same labs that were embroiled in the issues around Vicky Phelan or Emma McMahon? Are we using the same labs and those labs are safe, or are we now using different labs?
No, we're using the same labs. We were, and I don't want to overly confuse. There's a lot in this report for me to just discuss in a short period of time, and I know people are trying to digest it all. There was a lab used up until 2012 called CPL. Dr. Scally says in the report that he's satisfied with their quality management processes too. He's satisfied that was safe. But he did find in August that they had outsourced at a time of surge, I think in 2010, to some other laboratories in the US that the HSE seemed unaware of. And he's asked, can he do another piece of work in relation to that? But be very clear so messages don't get confused here. That is not a lab being used by the Irish Health Service today. It hasn't been used since 2012. And I think that is an important point. And I also need to be clear, he's not suggesting that everything was great in terms of process. He's saying that the HSE acted legally in terms of procurement, but could have done a better job, quite frankly. He's saying that there should be better data publication. Because these labs operate in different countries, he'd like one consistent standard of data so that we can compare and contrast labs and publish regularly. He'd like the winning proposals for any procurement, appended to the contract. So there's a lot of suggestions as to how you can do the process better. But on the question of safety, Dr. Scally is very, very clear that the labs being used today are safe.
He did say that he had identified some serious system flaws. He's made 50 recommendations. Obviously, you can't tell me all 50 here today. But the main recommendations that need to be implemented, that need to bring about some change to cervical check, what are they?
So Dr. Scally says in his report, we should be setting, I'm paraphrasing him now, but we should be setting as a national objective the idea that we want to effectively eradicate or eliminate cervical cancer. Other countries have tried to do that, like Australia and New Zealand. Why can't Ireland? We know that the number of women who have cervical cancer has significantly decreased as a result of screening. Let's move to HPV testing, which is a more accurate form of screening. We'll do that early next year. Let's introduce the HPV vaccine for boys. We will do that in 2019. Very important recommendations like when we set up the new HSE board, make sure there's 2 patient reps on it so that we actually embed the voice of patients in our health service. Because if all of this could be fixed by a piece of legislation, that would be straightforward enough. This is cultural as well. He talks about the need for a national screening service to advise me or any of my successors on the department on screening that would have patient reps on it that would consider how best to do audit. I'm decided.
Are you talking about a national screening service that looked at all our screening systems as opposed to cervical check?
Like they have in the UK, where the Minister of the Day can say, look, actually, I want to seek the advice of the National Screening Service and call in a combination of medical experts from your own country, internationally, and patient representatives on that. He talks about the need to enhance the voice of the patient. So I've decided today I'm going to establish an independent patient advisory council, and I'll bring proposals on that next month. He talks about the need for the Medical Council to tighten up its own guidelines on open disclosure so that doctors have absolute clarity. He wants us to legislate for duty of candour so that it's not optional as to whether you tell the patient when something seriously goes wrong. And there are many, many other recommendations as well in relation to procurement, in relation to the governance structure of screening, having a national director for screening so there's one individual in charge of it. There's definitely a lack of role clarity in there.
I know Scally hasn't identified any, he hasn't pointed a finger at any individual here, but you mentioned the new HSE board. There hasn't been a board in the HSE. You mentioned perhaps a national umbrella group looking at all screening. Was this a failure of governance? Is that what's actually happened here? The HSE didn't have anyone. We might have had Tony O'Brien at the top of it, but we didn't have proper governance looking at these things, and some of that is the failure of having a board in place.
I think definitely the lack of a board has contributed to a lack of governance in the HSE, and I'm aware that the decision was taken to abolish the board, but that was at a time when we were moving to abolishing the HSE. That's not the case now, so we need to bring back the HSE board, and we'll do that this year. Governance was definitely a big part of it. Like in many ways, when you pick up a report, the easiest thing in the world is if the report says X or Y individual did it. I would encourage people to read this report, read the recommendations, particularly the foreword of the report, and you'll see that he describes the audit as a laudable aim. That people who are trying to reduce cervical cancer, people, good, decent, dedicated people, and he talks about them like that, who are trying to make a difference, decided it would be a good idea to audit. And not every country audits. not every country audits. They were trying to be forward thinking. And being very frank, there was an absolute botched job made of it. And that botched job caused pain, suffering and hurt to women who already had cervical cancer on top of and indeed to their families.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's where the nub of this, I think, lies, is the fact that we have a de-anonymised system. We had open disclosure, but we had no real policies around it. And that whole area has been free floating and has caused massive distress. But in May, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar did say that women suing the state over inaccurate cervical screening tests will not be dragged through the courts. Is that still the case? Because if we accept, and I think Susan Mitchell, health journalist this morning, said that there still seems to be confusion about what constitutes a false negative in terms of a screening test. Are we looking at a situation now where anyone who has a false negative and is patient who has cancer is going to be automatically compensated? Are we looking at a case where they are going to have to go to court and Taoiseach will have to row back on what he said? What's going to happen going forward to women who find themselves, as could happen, as we both know, in the same position as someone like Vicky Phelan found herself?
So two aspects to that. The issue of non-disclosure, the decision that the state took or indeed didn't take, but the failure of the state to disclose is something the state has accepted a liability for. And therefore the women who were not disclosed to deserve for the issue of non-disclosure to be compensated and addressed for that. The issue of was this a false negative or negligent? Let me try and, because I'm not a doctor and you are, but in getting my head around this, there's a very useful infographic on page 11 of the report. And Dr. Scally basically points out that if 1,000 women go for screening, about 20 of those women will have precancerous cells. And screening will detect those precancerous cells in about 15. So about 5, very sadly, but due to the limitations of screening, will not be detected. That is the normal range of limitations. That is not to say, and I am not saying that some of the very high profile cases and ones we know about have not been negligent. I'm not qualified to say that, and obviously settlements have been made and court cases have been heard. What the Taoiseach wants to do, and what I want to do, what the government wants to do, is find a non-adversarial way of adjudicating on that. So rather than having to go up to the High Court, that you could have a non-adversarial where you say, look, here's my expert report that shows this wasn't a false negative, there was actually something else here, there was negligence, and that can be adjudicated upon. We've asked a very eminent High Court judge, Judge Charlie Meenan, to do some work on this. He's due to report back to government on the second week of October. He's meeting the women impacted, he's meeting the families impacted, he's meeting their legal representatives, he's meeting the State Claims Agency, and I'm very confident that he can come up with a mechanism.
Are you? Because I, as you rightly pointed out, I am a doctor, and I feel I have to point out the elephant in the room is what you've just said. There'll be 20 abnormal smears, but 15 will be picked up. If a quarter of abnormal smears are going to be missed, and that actually, sadly, and people don't like hearing this, but that is in line with international norms of false negatives. If a quarter of them are going to be missed, that's a lot of women who are going to have a false negative. It's you know, if 5 in every 1,000, but we've done 3 million smears, it's a lot of women. Simon, we could be facing into a situation whereby cervical screening becomes incredibly expensive because of litigation and incredibly expensive because of compensation. And if you try and stay focused on patients, if we try and keep patient focus at our heart here, what's going to happen to women in general whose incidences of cancer are reduced by 7% year on year by the screening thing, if it becomes so expensive that we don't want to do it anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I keep on saying I have two responsibilities here. I have a responsibility to the 221 women and their families, and I have a responsibility to every woman and indeed every citizen in our country who benefits of screening. And it's meeting both of those responsibilities has to be my concern. But every woman has a right, though, if she believes there has been negligence, to have that negligence adjudicated upon and considered and addressed in a non-adversarial manner. So that's what we're trying to do, is find out a way that if a woman believes, no, this wasn't a false negative, this wasn't a false negative, this was negligent, and I have an expert report to prove it. How can you do that in a way that doesn't involve a witness box in the High Court? That's what we're trying to find. And that is different. You're right. I mean, false negatives are different to negligence. And in fairness, I've heard people like Vicky Phelan say that very clearly. Not every false negative is negligent. Not every false negative is negligent. Screening has limitations. The good news, if we move to HPV testing, which we will do early next year, the number of false negatives reduces. So back to our 20 women out of 1,000 will have precancerous cells. At the moment,
we're going to pick up 15.
Under HPV, we'll pick up 18.
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden, there's less false negatives. We're picking up more precancerous cells. We're saving more lives. So I have to be obsessed as Health Minister with moving to HPV testing, with moving to the HPV vaccine, with calling out the utter nonsense that we hear from ill-informed people who sometimes purport to be medical experts in relation to a vaccine that saves lives. You've done a lot of work on this. You've also taken a lot of abuse in relation to the work you've done on it. People like Laura Brennan have done incredible work on this too. We need to get the HPV vaccine rate up. We need to get the screening rates up. We need to bring we need to move to HPV testing. This is what. So as a policymaker, I'm not a doctor. I'm not working in the hospital. I'm not working in the HSE. As a policymaker, what can I do? I can legislate for duty of candour. I can set up a HSE board. I can put patient reps on it. I can bring in an independent patient advisory council. I can move to HPV testing. I can extend the HPV vaccine. These have to be the focus of my energy.
Do we know how many women are currently awaiting going to court? Do we know what kind of level of litigation is coming down the line around all of this? We hear about 221 women. Do we know how many of those may end up as a court case?
I don't have a number off the top of my, and the number varies obviously because people can, the numbers can change at any time. But I think we know that there's some that are deemed kind of clinically urgent, and I hope though that the new process that Judge Meenan can put in place in the next couple of weeks can help guide us how better to deal with them. But you are right. We do have to have, in a very calm and respectful and sensitive manner, the discussion about the difference between false negatives and negligence, because there's a very big difference.
Lastly, I still believe there's a huge amount of concern among women out there. I'm even looking at the text line. People are going, "Are we still using these labs?" People are talking about the expired smear tests. These things, in terms of timelines for when these recommendations are going to be brought about, and in terms of reassuring women who might be listening this morning, who could be waiting on a smear test result, who could have been told their smear test that they had 2 months ago for free as a catch-up or as a reassurance has now expired and they have to go again. What would you say to those women, speaking directly to the Minister, about what kind of confidence they can have in our screening service, particularly if there's somebody who has some concerns around their health in this area?
Well, look, if you, my own wife, my own mother, my own sister, I would recommend to each and every one of them that they use Cervical Check, and that they get their smears in accordance with the medical advice in terms of when they're due them, and that they can have confidence in the labs. Not because I, as the Minister for Health, say that, but because Dr. Scally says it. One of the most frequent email I got, and I got many of them, was, Minister, how can we know if I want to know is my smear going to America? Is that safe? And I understand that, because there's a lot of misinformation and confusion out there in a vacuum, perhaps. Dr. Scally has said today, yes, the quality in those labs you can have confidence over. I think that's really important. On the timelines, he asks us to come back within 3 months with an implementation plan. He's very kindly agreed that he will externally oversee that, which I think is really important, that it keep everyone's feet to the coals. But some of the things we'll move on very quickly, like the Independent Patient Advisory Council, I hope to have proposals on next month. The HSE board legislation and the Patient Safety Bill on duty of candour will progress in this term of the law.
Okay, so timeline 3 months we're talking about. And do we have capacity within our primary care system to actually do all these smear tests? We've had obviously a huge surge in women looking for smear tests, and that's why we have the expiry
there was a degree,
situation.
There was a kind of an unfortunate dilemma here where a lot of women were understandably saying, look, I want to get a repeat smear. And then obviously the more women who got repeat smears, I suppose, the greater an impact that put on the service. I still think the fact that so many women wanted reassurance that on balance it was the right thing to do. It has put a pressure on the system. We are obviously engaging with our labs about future contracts. Obviously the environment in which the discussion's been had. I hope the Scally report will help provide greater clarity and assurance that could help those discussions as well.
All right, thank you for that indeed. That is Simon Harris there, Minister for Health.